What is up? Welcome to Thursday, April the 15th edition of Roughing the Kicker, a daily Kansas City Chiefs podcast on arrowheadreport.com. I'm your host, Tucker Franklin, and joining me today is Kent Lee Platte. He's the NFL Analytics Director and Applications Development for Pro Football Network. You might know him as the creator of the Relative Athletic Score. You might even know him better when I say he's at MathBomb on Twitter. So, Kent, how you doing today, my man?
Fantastic, man. Glad you had me.
I'm happy that you're on too, because there's been a lot of talk about the relative athletic score. And for me, it's something that I just learned about this year. So how long have you kind of been working on the relative athletic score? And are you surprised how much it's grown?
So I started all the way back in 2013, and it grew a little bit. It was mostly just spreadsheets and your typical what we think of as an analytics nerd, right? Just a guy with a
Mhm.
spreadsheet. It grew a lot in 2017. I got over 15,000 players by that point, and it's grown exponentially since then. We just broke 21,000 players in the database this year. I've been on the Chicago Bears website, the Giants website, the Dolphins website, Packers, a couple other ones. It's been a lot of fun. It's not something that I saw coming, and it wasn't even really something I planned on happening. My whole reason behind creating it was just adding a little bit of context behind the testing metrics that we get. We always hear those buzzwords about guys that are quicker than fast or he's
Mhm.
explosive and terms like that. We get that thrown around every single year. And that doesn't mean anything to fans, doesn't mean
Yeah.
anything to us. We don't care. And then you look at even the individual metrics themselves. If a guy runs a 4.5, is that good? I mean, it sounds good. Is it good? I mean, it's okay if you're a wide receiver. It's really good if you're a defensive end. And RAS is meant to kind of illustrate those things because it compares the players to their position group across now 35 years of data from 1987 to today. And then it provides a 0 to 10 score. Everybody can understand a 0 to 10. 0 is bad,
Mhm.
10 is good, 5 is right in the middle. So it makes it really easy to understand from a contextual standpoint, so that casual fans and people who are much more into it alike can have a tool that they can look at and say, oh, wow, this guy's a really good athlete, or maybe there's a little bit more risk behind this guy.
That's kind of what I've really liked about it is the comparison values. I can see the percentiles on there and say, okay, this guy's, runs a pretty good 40 for being an offensive lineman. Now, if he was going to do that, you also have this setting on your website where you can check it for different positions. I think that's fun every now and again to, try a linebacker at safety. I know JOK from Notre Dame is thrown out there as a guy who could be a safety as well. So what kind of made you say, okay, I should make this into a website and I should make it interactive. I should tweet these out. What was kind of that point where you're like, okay, I've got something here. Now I should make it available to the public?
When I really started to build the database out, it was just a pet project. Like I said, I was building it in spreadsheets, and I just outgrew it. The calculations itself isn't super complicated. There's just a lot of it. There's a lot of math going on. So I just outgrew Microsoft Excel, and I had to do something else. So I built it out so that it would run everything programmatically. It would run everything instead of using Excel calculations, it would run everything by programs in Excel. Well, that got too big too. So now I'm sitting here like, well, I got to do something. So I moved it into an SQL database and Access. That got too big, too fast. And it just kept getting bigger and more complex. And I wanted to do more things with them. Once the interest started getting in there, I knew I had to do something where fans could go on and actually look this stuff up. Building a program was what I did originally, something you could download, but
Yeah.
it didn't work on everybody's computer. It's not, you can't get it up on your phone. There's a lot of limitations to that. So the ultimate conclusion was, look, I'm gonna put it out there that I want to do this online, see if I can get some fan support behind it. Fans enjoyed it. They provided a lot of donations for it. I was able to pay for the website, get all the stuff that I needed to put it up, and then spend the time and really push it out there, because this is something that people want. I don't charge for any of my content.
Hmm.
Everything is out there for free, and I'm just trying to add stuff that's fun and informative. Some of it's meaningful, right? Some
Yeah.
of it's meaningful because it's nice to know how guys compare to Pro Bowlers, for instance, or
Yeah.
guys with 1,000-yard receiving seasons. But some of it's not. It's just fun. Like you said, you can change positions. That's useful if you for guys like JOK, because you can
Mhm.
move him to safety and linebacker. But like I had someone ask me for Dontari Poe as a receiver once. Not sure that's going to be super useful, but it was fun.
Yeah.
And last year I did Isaiah Simmons at every position because people
Mm.
wanted that. So it's just there's some enjoyment factor too. But it came down to there was a need, and I knew a way that I could fill it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I know this was something that when I started to really dive into this NFL draft process, one of my friends, Craig Stout over at Arrowhead Pride, was like, "Hey, you guys need to be following Math Bomb so you guys can see all these come in." Have you gotten a little bit better at sorting out? You know, in these pro days, you always have these weird numbers. Have you been able to get a little bit better at sorting out kind of fact from crap when it comes to those numbers?
Yeah, most of the time when you get stuff, and people are really just kind of seeing this year because we had no combine. And most people don't really follow the pro day circuit. I've been following it for 8 years very closely. So
Wow.
for me, this is like, yeah, that's normal, you know? But most people aren't used to seeing, well, why is it that you get posted a 4.54 and then you come out later it's a 4.62? Well, the 4.54 that I got was from someone in the media. Media will usually report whatever the best time they hear is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not malicious. They're not trying to intentionally deceive anybody. It's just that it's local media at these pro days, and they want their guys to look good, so they post the best things. It's not the school trying to make their guys look good, because ultimately the numbers that the school releases isn't what goes to the NFL teams. They don't get those numbers from the school. There's scouts that they get that information from. So there's a bit of a misperception about how those numbers come out and how faked they are and how juiced they are. Um, and it goes to how they're timed too. You know, it used to be that all pro days were hand timed and the combine was laser timed, so a little bit more accurate,
Mm.
a little bit slower. But it's really not that way for every pro day anymore. A lot of these schools have started integrating laser timing in, to the point where it's really close. And just to tell you how close, as an example, this year almost every school reported time was within zero point zero 0.01 seconds for the 40-yard dash.
Wow.
Almost all of them. And when they were off, it was all of them that were off. We had a couple schools where all the times were off. So it came down to how the schools were reporting, which to me says that schools are doing a better job of reporting the numbers from the scouts rather than stuff that just makes their guys look good, because it doesn't have any meaning, right? It doesn't really mean anything. But a lot of it's perception. I'm used to it, and a lot of fans aren't. And it's a lot to just kind of pile on in one year. I keep trying to explain to everybody, like, no, this is normal. This is pretty normal. We're used to this. But it's tough when you're not, deep in it every day.
Right, and I know some of the casual fans will be like, "Oh, this is why we need a pro day, or this is why we need a combine, combine all universal." Is this kind of one of those years, especially when it comes with medicals, players getting to sit years off? You know, you see a lot of the FCS players who come out: Spencer Brown, Ellerson Smith, David Moore. Those guys, they went to the pro or went to the Senior Bowl, I should say. I always want to call it the Pro Bowl for some reason. They went to the Senior Bowl, and they had a little bit of exposure there. But do you think they would have benefited from a combine more than their pro day?
I think the combine is extremely helpful, and a lot of people don't realize how important the combine is. For me, it's great because that's where I get all my testing numbers. It's all in one spot. Everything's universal. There is some variance with how guys run their 40-yard dash, for instance, between pro days, just because the turf is different
Hmm.
and the environment's different. So it's not like pro days are exactly like the combine, but it's similar enough. But like you mentioned, the medicals are a huge deal at the combine. The interviews are a huge deal at the combine. The individual drills that we get to watch are important at the
Right.
combine, because it's not like the NFL teams are suddenly seeing this stuff, but fans, the folks that follow the football, that write for all these fan basing sites, this is the first exposure that we really get to a lot of these players. And you get to see them in the drills and see the difference between them and a lot of the other guys that they're competing with. That's huge for stuff that's fan facing, that's outward facing towards the fans. NFL teams, they can still do it because they can send guys, they can send their scouts to these pro days, they get tapes of the pro days,
Hmm.
but we don't get to see those even in a normal year. We usually just get the combine. So we have a lot less information this year than we usually do. The medicals and the interviews, I think, are a very underappreciated part of that, because we've seen guys completely tank the interviews and their draft stock has plummeted.
Right.
And we didn't really have that this year from anybody. There wasn't really anybody that had some interview related issue that saw their draft stock tank.
It's a lot harder to keep track of who interviewed who talked with who because it's all virtual now. So that's been kind of one of the tougher parts when we talk about, who have the Chiefs talked to, who have they gotten in a room with. And it's usually a virtual room when they do get in a room with them. So that's all pretty tough going here. So I'm going to ask you kind of some questions about some of these prospects because you've got a thread going on right now, kind of giving your overall thoughts. These pro days are over now. Now you're starting to kind of give your thoughts. So from a Chiefs perspective, offensive tackle was a big issue heading into this draft. Now, I think one of the favorite phrases that I've heard being used is this tackle class went from a really good tackle class to a really elite guard class. What do you think of that?
I think I get where you're going with that because there's a lot of guys in this class that don't have the best arm length.
Yeah.
And that gets thrown around a lot as this both as a too important stat, like if you don't reach this mark, you're just not a tackle, and a stat that's unimportant because some people just completely throw it out. And you'll always hear Joe Thomas, right? You'll always hear Joe Thomas. 32.5-inch arms, Joe Thomas had. Yeah, we know. We know that. He's one of those guys. But the average tackle has 34-inch arms. The average starter at offensive tackle has 34-inch arms. You might have seen that from another thread that we had going about a week ago about the average for the starters for the offensive line.
Yeah.
You know, that's just the way that it is. Average starters tend to be longer because they have to have that wingspan to be able to catch guys on the outside and the inside. It's not something that can be completely overlooked. This tackle class is really, really good from any standpoint. And from that athletic testing proves that out for the most part. Most of these guys are really, really, really good athletes. It's nuts. But a lot of them have shorter arms. Penei Sewell has a little bit shorter arms. Elijah Vera Tucker, Jalen Mayfield, a couple other guys. That arm length is a potential concern for. So, yeah, I think almost all of these guys are going to start at tackle. I think probably 3 or 4 of them are going to end up at guard, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because I think they would do really, really well there. They've got those athletic traits to really make them a standout at guard. You know, it's not a bad thing to be a good guard.
Right. And it's not. The Chiefs signed Joe Tooney, kind of bulk up that interior offensive line. As Patrick Mahomes has shown, he doesn't truly trust his interior offensive line. Sometimes I think getting those guys in there like Kyle Long, Joe Tooney, be good for the long term there. But I'm interested. I wanted to ask you this question. I know that the relative athletic score doesn't. I was curious how it's weighted because I know you do have height, weight in there. I think you have bench press for offensive tackles. I was curious why you don't include arm length or wingspan for wide receivers or tight ends, and I didn't know how much you put into their frame or their size and into the score.
And that's why I didn't add that into the score because frame is such a big deal. It's so much more important than the metrics that you use to measure height, weight, arm length, and wingspan. It's way more important what a player's frame looks like than just those individual metrics. So I didn't add those in. And because I don't differentiate by position for how everything's weighted, I felt the best way to do it was to simply weight everything equally and only use height and weight because I have height and weight for everybody. I don't have arm length or hand size or wingspan for everybody. So it allows me to test that. And all the size grade really does is weight the other metrics. There has to be some way to weight for size. And I did an extensive amount of testing on this to make sure that this was the fairest way to do it while keeping with the overall framework that I wanted to do for Raz. And it does. I get that question all the time for offensive tackles about guys that are like 6'5". You know, why is that below average for a tackle? It's like, I don't think you realize tackles are huge.
Yeah.
Like in general, they are gigantic people. And even though the average starting offensive tackle is just about 6'6", I think it's just below 6'6", the average tackle prospect is going to be in that 6'5" range. That's normal. That doesn't make them a below average size, not really, but it's about average. And it seems like it's a lot lower just because there's so many huge tackles that have come out over the last 35 years that people don't really realize. Tackles are huge.
Yeah, they really are. And you look at, Stone Forsythe, the kid from Miami of Ohio, who's their left tackle. I can't think of his name all of a sudden, but he's another
Tommy
6'8"
Doyle.
guy. Yes, he's another huge guy out there. These are just ginormous human beings that we don't really realize when we're watching football on Sunday. Then you see their measurements, you're like, oh my goodness. We did a little radio bit on Sports Radio 810 in Kansas City, measuring our own arms, because we like to talk about, and especially this is a really hot topic in Kansas City about tackle arm length. Andy Reid doesn't draft tackles with under 34 and a quarter arms in his history, and that's a pretty decent sample size to go off of right there. So we were measuring our arms to say, okay, now we're saying these guys can't play tackle. How long are our arms? And my arms sadly came in at 27 inches, the lowest in the room. So I was like, okay, well, 34-inch arms are pretty long. And I think that's sometimes one of those things, those context is really important.
Yeah, don't worry about short arms, man. All that means is you got dibs on the nickname T-Rex, and they can't take that away from you.
Right. My name starts with a T too, Tucker. So
There you
T-Rex
go.
sounds like a perfect nickname. It goes right into it. So can't appreciate you joining me. Got a few more before I let you go. What's been the best part about creating the RAS score?
It's been a blast because I didn't expect when I started doing this that it would ever pick up and that I would
Mm,
get to do interviews on actual team sites and things like that. Never would have thought any of that kind of stuff would happen. And yeah, it's just so much fun to do that stuff. I mean, you cover your favorite team. You know how fun it can be
yeah.
just to talk about sports and to really get into it. But having people that reach out to me, players that reach out to me and want to know what their score is, that's always been so much fun to me. And one of my favorite interactions happened this year. We had an offensive lineman who ran, I mean, he's one of the top testing tackles of the class. And he was mad because I didn't score him even higher because he got a time that was a little bit faster. He wanted to put that in. I was like, look, I got a process I follow. I take the unofficial numbers until I get the official ones, and then I use those ones. And he was mad that he wasn't slightly higher, and it was seriously a difference of 0.01. But he was fighting for it, man. He was arguing for it, arguing why I should change it, why I should
Mm,
make a change. And that kind of stuff really gets to me because you see that competitive nature that a lot of these guys have. They really
yeah.
want to do well, even when it's something that ultimately doesn't mean all that much. It's the difference is so small. It's not
Hmm.
that big of a deal. But he was like, no, I want it. I ran it. I got it. This is the time that I got. You should change it. But that's been a lot of fun to me is seeing just how competitive those guys are. You talk about competitiveness, but
Hmm.
there's being able to see that in my sphere, the stuff that I work in is a lot of fun.
Have you been able to see a correlation between your scores and NFL success? I'm just kind of curious.
For most positions, yeah,
Mm,
it's not necessarily clear whether it's a causality thing, right? It's
right.
not a the higher score you get, the better you're going to do. It's not like that. It's thresholds, which is why I set up the whole color coding thing and why the color coding is set up the way that it is. Anything below 5, I have it in the red. Anything above 8, I have in green. Anything in between is in yellow. And the reason that I did that is when I did my comparisons for Pro Bowls, 1,000-yard receiving seasons, 1,000-yard rushing seasons, and double-digit sack seasons.
Yeah.
They all had almost exactly the same percentile of hits for guys that were over 8 and then guys that were below 5. And
Huh.
of course, obviously, everything in between. The percentages were almost the same across the board, regardless of which position I was looking at for those things. So that was really interesting to me. So now I'm trying to find other ways to gauge success. And that's where the tough part comes in, is finding ways to say, what is a successful player, right? You don't
Yeah.
think it would be that hard, but when you're trying to put data on it, it's really tough because there's no stat for an offensive line. You can get group stats for how the whole team does, but that's not an individual stat for an offensive line. So I'm trying to break it down. I'm starting to pull data for starts, for career AV, yearly AV, which is a stat
Mhm.
measured on Pro Football Reference, for those of you who aren't familiar. I'm trying to put together as much data as I can so that I can expand that even further. And then, of course, show that to people by allowing them to pull up these tables and say, hey, go look at this stuff, make your own
Yeah.
decisions. And then the fun one I'm trying to get is I'm trying to break down the rosters by year. So you could go look at the Kansas City Chiefs for 2017 and be like, well, what was their average score this year?
Yeah.
What was their receiving core look like this year? I'm trying to put that together. It's just a massive amount of data,
Hmm.
trying to put all this stuff together. So it's a little ways out yet, but there is a correlation for most positions. The biggest one easily is tight end.
Oh,
The
interesting.
defensive end is another one, offensive tackle, and then cornerback, linebacker, receiver, and running back all have good correlation. But there's so much typing at those positions, different types of players,
Hmm.
that it gets a little muddy once you start actually looking into it, because there's a big difference between your Julio Joneses, your Calvin Johnsons, and guys like Antonio Brown or Steve Smith.
Right.
There's a big difference in those types of players. So the athletic requirements are a little bit different. So there is a correlation. Not sure how clear it is because of the typing stuff.
Yeah. That's interesting because when I look at this, some people say, "Well, there's not a direct, correlation to how they're going to do," and you got to take it with context, take it with a grain of salt. It's just really to compare these numbers with other guys. That's what I like to use the tool for, to see how they stack up against other prospects in there. And how long did it take you to build up this database? Do you do it all yourself?
Oh yeah, I am a team of one. I always
Oh
joke
my.
that I have a secretary. It's my wife. She does some of the work for me when I'm trying to pull this stuff together. But yeah, it's mostly just me. And I say that meaning I'm the one that puts the stat together. I'm the one that
Mhm.
collects the data. But there's so many people involved in NFL scouting in general that really go underappreciated.
Yeah.
Scouts are the ones out there that are getting these numbers. They report those numbers to what's called the APT, which are the guys that actually send those numbers out to the NFL. Websites like Draft Scout, they compile those numbers over time. You know, there's guys like Jim Nagy from the Senior Bowl who follows all these players and tracks them and makes sure that anytime he finds a number, he makes sure that's out there because there's fan interest that people are trying to make sure
Yeah.
that that stuff's out there. I'm trying to do a better job of sourcing where I get that information from because this has only been online for a year and change.
Mhm.
You know, I don't have that built out as well as I'd like to. I'm trying to get that better out there. But there's a lot of people involved with making this kind of thing happen, even if the actual stat itself is just me.
Yeah. I know when I told people that you were coming on the podcast, they're like, "Oh, that's awesome. We love to look at the RAS scores." That's something that especially us at Arrowhead Report like to look at. And there's been some really impressive RAS scores, and there's been some pretty tough ones, I'll say. We have Jordan Foote, who's our draft analyst here, was a big Paris Ford guy. Still is a big Paris Ford guy. He didn't benefit very much from his pro day, sadly. It was a tough look for
He
him.
didn't. You can blame that on the turf conditions if you want to. So there was a
Yeah.
turf condition issue at that at Pitt. So you can always just blame it on that. And be like, well, the turf was bad. That's why.
That's true.
Everybody's got to have a dog ate my homework, man. If everybody's going to have their pro day at their school, you can always just say, well, turf conditions.
Yep, and I know that that's kind of the nice thing that they like about the combine. Indianapolis is a known slow turf, but it's all consistent for all the runners. And what I've heard actually a lot is it's a real psychological toll on these guys too. Being in Indianapolis for I think it's 3 days leading up to the actual combine events, so they actually are going through these tests. I don't believe we had Wonderlic tests this year. That's too bad we don't get to see those scores come out. But it's all a psychological thing once they get to the 40, and then it's how those guys deal with that.
Yeah, and you see it too for some guys. You know, if a guy runs a poor 40, you can usually see that they're disappointed in what they did. Like I said, all these guys are competitors. How they overcome that adversity is one of those things because if a guy's really competitive and he runs a time that he considers slow, you'd expect him to go faster the next time he's out there. And if he doesn't and he looks dejected and that body language, your shoulders start to slump and stuff, teams are paying attention to those kinds of things. And it's important when we have those types of situations. And people are a lot more comfortable in their natural environment at their pro day, at their school, around their
Yep.
players and their coaches. It's a lot easier. So I'm sure that part plays into it as much. It might even be part of why we didn't have a whole lot of questions about interviews and stuff, how those
Mhm.
things went, because all these guys are in their own comfortable environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't even think about that. It has been relatively quiet draft in terms of interviews when it comes to stock, as we already mentioned earlier. But can't appreciate you joining me on today's episode. Before I let you go, you're a diehard, born and raised Lions fan. I want to get your opinion on the Matt Stafford trade. Do you think it was right for the Lions?
I think the trade had to happen once we found out that Stafford was asking for a trade that he didn't want to go through another rebuild, and there was no way out of a rebuild. Right?
Right.
They can call it a retool if they want, but we're not tools. We've seen this
Uh-huh.
before. We know what it's called. It's a rebuild. You know, once it was clear that he just didn't want to go through another rebuild, and the team was willing to let him get traded, that was happening. Um, Trading him to the Rams and the compensation they got back with him, I don't have any problem with. The acquisition of Goff was the biggest piece that I didn't like because Goff is just not a quality NFL starter, and at his
Right.
cost, it's way worse. It hamstrings the team for at least a season, up to 2 seasons, because of the amount of cap that he's going to command, and the likelihood that they're going to start him because Brad Holmes drafted him with LA. He's going to look at this like a reclamation project, and they're trying to do one of the hardest things to do in the NFL, which is make a bad quarterback good.
Mhm.
It's a lot easier to take a moldable guy, a guy that has the tools and those traits. But if they're already been in the NFL for 4 years or however long it is, you've already seen what they can do at the pro level. You've seen them in a pro offense against pros. You can point to guys like Ryan Tannehill, occasionally Alex Smith, but all those first round picks that people like to point to as busts, those are also guys that didn't get their reclamation project. They didn't
Mhm.
work when they got picked up by another team. So it's a lower odds than drafting a guy and trying to develop him just by default, because all the reclamation projects are guys who were drafted and failed. So it's just double dipping on it. The odds are not good. I don't like the cost that it came for it, but ultimately Brad Holmes is a really good general manager prospect.
Mhm.
He's very good at identifying defensive talent and finding ways to build up a defense. He's very strong, analytically minded guy. His evaluation of quarterbacks has been poor, so I'm a little worried about that because his evaluation of quarterbacks has been poor. But he has Anthony Lynn and John Dorsey and a nice group of guys who are there to get in his ear and hopefully pull him in the right direction. I hate that we saw Stafford go. Stafford's been one of my
Yeah.
favorite players since his time at Georgia. He was one of my favorite college quarterbacks. So it's sad to see him go, but I'm glad that he went to a team that he likes and that he will get a shot with. And hopefully he does good things there, and hopefully this rebuild works this time.
You ready to eat some kneecaps with Dan Campbell up there? My goodness. He's I saw his speech the other day at the Ford plant, I think it was, and he's a guy that's gonna make you want to run through a brick wall.
He is. He's and like the kneecaps thing was like a very small snippet of his whole
Right, yeah.
interview, his original one. And he had so many great football quotes. But the moment he said that, you were like, this is gonna be a thing, isn't it? This is gonna be a thing. There's gonna be t-shirts made, and there was. But yeah, he's a motivator, man. He's very
Yeah.
clearly a guy that likes to get guys going. And he had, I believe, a 10 RAS when he came out. Now that I'm thinking about it, I know he had a really high score,
Really?
but I believe when he
Oh.
came out, I'm actually going to pull it up because I'm pretty sure it was an actual 10. And yeah, he had a 10 when he came out.
Wow.
If he were to come out today with the numbers he put up at 99, it would still be a 9.85 out of 10.
Wow.
Guy's a great athlete.
That's impressive. Well, Ken, I appreciate you spending some time with me talking about the RAS score. I guess saying RAS score is kind of redundant because the S is score. So talking about RAS, I don't know
RAS
how many times.
score, RAS
Yeah.
score.
Yeah, RAS score. Yeah, we'll say it like that. So appreciate you joining me on today's episode. Go follow Kent on Twitter at MathBomb if you don't already. A great guy to follow. There's just a lot of football stuff there. That if you love football, you're gonna love following Kent. So I appreciate you joining me.
Thanks so much, man. You have a good day.
This has been an episode of Roughing the Kicker on ArrowheadReport.com. I'm your host, Tucker Franklin. Go follow me on Twitter at Tucker D. Franklin. Stay up to date with the show. Tomorrow, I'll be back with the boys, Connor Christopherson, Jordan Foote. We're going to be doing the best of the RTK mocks. So until then, I'll talk to you tomorrow.